Hello everyone, and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. We should have a fantastic show for you guys to open up the week. We are starting off with a very interesting fantasy football segment, kind of going over players that I do not believe you should draft or, in all reality, overdraft. We're also going to be looking for the first time ever into a training camp and assessing that aspect of the game fantasy-wise. We're going to be looking at perhaps one of the most controversial teams to talk about in the Cleveland Browns in terms of fantasy. We're going to be looking at Quinn Ewers, one of my favorite college players, plays for my favorite team, Hook'em. And then we're going to do a nice little segment where we go over some teams in terms of prop bets. I'm talking about the Cardinals and Panthers, and while they certainly aren't the most exciting teams in terms of placing betting odds on, they're definitely more excitable than you think. But before we even begin with any of our show today, I do want to remind you yet again to please like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network as a whole. It is greatly appreciated by all involved. We also do receive some tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving them at the link GSMC.cloud. It is a huge support, both me, my fellow podcasters, and the network as a whole. We also accept any questions, comments, or concerns about the show at large, and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. So without further ado, let's jump right into what should be a very exciting show, like I said, to start off the week. Happy Monday to you all. Now, in terms of fantasy football, you seem to always go into your draft with a confident strategy, no matter what it is. But somewhere along this line, the strategy gets messed up. Maybe it's due to the fact that there are more players available than you thought. Maybe it's due to the fact that there are less players available than you thought. Maybe it's due to the fact that there really isn't as much discrepancy between positions anymore. And so, there are certain players who you may not necessarily be comfortable drafting, or some players who you overdraft out of panic. And so I feel like this segment is going to do the job of dissuading you from going into this with a game plan, because everyone's game plan during a fantasy football draft does not work out unless, of course, you have the top pick in every round and you have your whole entire thing set up and you can pick whichever player you choose. That's not going to happen. And so at each position, I'm going to go through some players that you don't want to draft or overdraft, for that matter. Start off with perhaps the easiest one to talk about. That is the QB position, because in the QB position, you know your tiers. You know who's going to be at the top, who people are looking at immediately, and you know who's kind of in the middle, and you know who's kind of near the bottom. So I feel as if QBs don't necessarily have to have so much emphasis placed on them, because there's a wider pool of opportunity for you to pick up at least a very serviceable QB for your starting spot. That being said, the first thing that I want to mention is you don't have to overdraft the big names. The Mahomeses of the world, the Allens, the Hurts, the Jacksons of the world. You don't have to overdraft them. You can sit back, wait a little bit, build depth through your running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, and even your flex position. And by the 5th or 6th round, I promise and guarantee you that at least one of those names will still be there. That being said, if you don't get them, there are still going to be a lot of options. Like I saw in my own fantasy draft, I kind of wasn't even paying attention to the QB position, and I got kind of caught up in building my lineup through more skill position talent. I still ended up with Brock Purdy as my starter, who is always serviceable and should always have the opportunity to garner a lot of fantasy points any given week because of this weapons that he has. And then I also got Jared Goff, who perhaps has the best weapons in the NFC. So it's not all about name in fantasy football. It's all about finding that positional value that might not have been thought about before the draft. Everyone wants to swing for the fences in terms of the quarterback position. That's not going to be the case. Someone's going to get Mahomes, and it most definitely probably won't be you. So you have to have a second plan. And that's what I did. I didn't panic in terms of drafting a quarterback, and I sat comfortably and picked up someone who I really thought was serviceable. Now let's go on to the second tier, because there's a name in the second tier that's been kind of floating around as someone who is very largely a boom or bust guy, and that is Anthony Richardson. A lot of people don't really know how much emphasis to place on the small sample size we received of Anthony Richardson last year, due to the fact that a shoulder injury in your rookie season is always kind of dangerous to kind of circumvent the year after. And so, Anthony Richardson, I love him as a player. He has elite size. His arm strength is ridiculous. His rushing ability is ridiculous too. But I still have that seed of doubt in my mind about how he's going to come back. And if you really think about it, Indianapolis isn't going to exceed expectations again. They really were a surprise team. So I feel like placing Anthony Richardson on any tier above, say, the serviceable quarterback for your fantasy team, perhaps not even a starter, I think, is really kind of crossing the line, bridging the gap in between these two kind of mindsets. Because if you think of him as elite, that's definitely very risky, because there are going to be a lot of quarterbacks, like I said, in that middle tier who I would definitely grab. Richardson could be one of them, but I'm still kind of skeptical about how he's going to look in this team. And we talk about some older guys. How much trust do you place in guys like Aaron Rodgers and Kirk Cousins? Because they're both in offensive systems that seem like they're decent fits, but at the end of the day, they are getting older. Kirk Cousins is coming off an Achilles injury. So is Rodgers, for that matter. And I feel as if too much heavy emphasis is being placed on their success. A lot is hinging on the offensive successes of these teams. I'm not sure if Aaron Rodgers or guys like that, and Kirk Cousins for that matter, are going to be able to sustain their levels of success that we've seen throughout their career, especially in fantasy, because they don't necessarily translate as fantasy guys either. They're not guys who are going to get you the production and stats you need in fantasy. They're guys who largely are comfortable with distributing the ball in any way they can. They're not big names anymore. And so, how you feel offensively about these teams should not sway your decision on whether or not you swing for the fences on a Rodgers or a Cousins. Because I certainly do not think they're on the plus side of, say, the tier 2 of quarterbacks who I think about. They're kind of declining and lowering in my rankings and rungs in terms of where they are. That being said, they do have good offenses, and should they develop rapport with certain players, then, anything can happen. But right now, I'm very low on them. Now, let's switch to the running back position, because that's very interesting. Let's talk about someone much like Anthony Richardson, who burst onto the scene, had a lot more games than Anthony Richardson, for that matter, to really prove himself, and that's Kyren Williams. Kyren Williams is definitely going to be someone who is going to be tossed around your fantasy league if, people feel he's better as a flex option, because that's my big question about him. Is he too good to be true? Is he kind of in this mirage where everyone's searching for an elite running back outside of, say, Christian McCaffrey or Breece Hall, and Kyren Williams is truly a revelation? That being said, is he really going to sustain that level of success? Or the Rams, for that matter, going to sustain that level of success? How long is their rope? And so, Kyren Williams, I feel like, is going to be a player who's not going to have a cemented spot on really a lot of people's fantasy teams. I just think he's a guy who's going to be a nice streaming option where he's going to have disappointing days. And you're going to have to take them with a grain of salt and accept the fact that he's just a very volatile player, because I truly think that when someone that young has a breakout season, it's very hard to sustain. And then, similar to Ramondre Stevenson, I think that the Patriots running back room, because of Antonio Gibson, is going to get a little bit muddy. I think a lot of their offense is going to go through those two, because they really don't know what they have in Drake May just yet. They're going to have to see in real game time with him. But I do still like Ramondre Stevenson as an option. It's just a matter of where he places in your opinions and what you think of him and how you think of this Patriots offense as a whole. And then, to wrap it all up, let's talk about some receivers. Let's talk about how Stephon Diggs fits into this Texans offensive scheme, if he even is going to be the number one receiver in terms of target share on this team, because that will certainly affect how this whole offense operates. Because if C.J. Stroud has to pay extra attention to Stephon Diggs, then who knows how kind of convoluted this Texans wide receiver group is going to become, because they developed a rapport last season. You want to sustain it for this season, and so adding Stephon Diggs might muddy the waters a little bit. And then, to finish this all off, let's talk about a guy in Brandon Ayuk who maybe has been impacted by trade talks and trade rumors. How is he going to play in this offense, knowing that he's either in a prove-it season for himself to stay on the 49ers, or he's auditioning for another team? And so the wide receivers, while there's a lot of talent there, it's also a question of how they fit, what affects them, and this all-encompassing mindset of which positions you value. And if I look at this list of all these positions, I think that the one thing that I can offer my advice upon is to not panic. Because if you do, then all these players kind of lose their luster. And they all have something special about them that really makes them players that you want to debate about. But at the end of the day, it's ultimately your opinion that matters. Do you really view these players as well as others? That's the question. But after this, we are going to be looking at the Cleveland Browns training camp and what this means in terms of implications for fantasy. They're definitely a team to look out for. We'll be back after the break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day, which should be a good one, I do want to remind you that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. But we're going to stick with this screen, and we are going to discuss a team in the midst of training camp. A team that certainly is going to be heavily scrutinized at almost every position in terms of fantasy. and that is the Cleveland Browns. And the reason why this is the only team that really intrigues me and catches my eye in terms of their training camp preparations is because of the storylines. So many different storylines at each and every position that really catch the eye. So, I just wanted to present some research. I read this in an article. I was inspired by it because of the intrigue surrounding the Browns, and I really wanted to get more in depth about how to view this team come fantasy draft time. Without further ado, let's jump right into what makes the Browns such an interesting team. And let's start off, before we get to our little graphics that I present, let's start off with the coaching. Let's start off with how I believe they set up, because Kevin Stefanski did come out and say, as the Browns head coach, that he was going to call the plays, ultimately calling the shots on the offensive side of the ball. And the reason why I like that more than, say, other people is because of what Kevin Stefanski brings offensively and what it means for Deshaun Watson, most importantly. Because when we think about Kevin Stefanski centered offenses and the kind of plays and variations he develops, I think the prime example of a season where a quarterback regained their form or found themselves was with Baker Mayfield in 2020 when the Browns made the playoffs for the first time in a very long time. The way Kevin Stefanski simplified the offense for him, really honed in on Mayfield's biggest traits and assets, and really developed him into someone who could be a competent quarterback, not have to do too much, but really focus on operating an offense at a high level. And I think that's what Deshaun Watson needs right now. Coming off a shoulder injury, hasn't really impressed with the Browns. A lot of guaranteed money on the line for both parties involved. And so this season really needs to be focused on simplifying things for Deshaun Watson so that he's not overwhelmed. He's not so consumed with trying to be the best. Because if he is, that's where we see all the pratfalls come into play. And so let's talk about Deshaun Watson. Now, like I said, coming back from the shoulder injury is definitely going to be the prime directive for Deshaun Watson. He's not at full health just yet. He's still training with padding and contact. Everyone's trying to implement that back into the system so that he's comfortable absorbing hits. And so I think the importance of that is that should Deshaun Watson have more RPO-oriented plays, let's say, I think it's very important that he's not scared to continue to develop that part of the game, because as a rusher in Cleveland, that's where Deshaun's had so much success. Where he hasn't had success is throwing early in downs and throwing in, first and 10, second and 10 situations. The Browns threw the football on 41% of their first downs. If that number reduces, then I think Deshaun's set up in a very nice little situation for himself. Because I think the best parts of Kevin Stefanski's offense is in late downs when you operate out of system or in the play action sets. And that's where a lot of Deshaun Watson's bread and butter is going to have to come from. A lot of his comfortability will have to surface from those areas. I don't think the Browns want to throw early and often. They have a setup where they feel comfortable enough relying upon their running backs. We'll talk about them a little later in this segment. Instead of, just throwing the ball early enough. And have the wide receiver core now to really help them. But let it be on later down so that Deshaun Watson can really settle into games, understand the flow of the game, and most importantly, not have to be the hero every single time. But let's talk about the weirdness of the running back situation, shall we? Obviously, we all know about what happened with Nick Chubb. Will he ever be the same? Will always be the question hanging in people's mind, because right now, he's in his age 30 season, entering a contract year, and the Browns are going to have to decide fairly quickly whether or not Nick Chubb has anything left in the tank after an injury very similar to the one he sustained in college, where he did come back from that, but this is different. This is towards the end of his prime. And so, how the Browns handle him is going to really affect his fantasy stock as well, because they have very capable backs in Jerome Ford, Deontay Foreman, Pierre Strong, in every single situation that they want to use them in offense that can really help Deshaun Watson settle down. But there's not really an RB1 or even an RB10 for that matter in this offense. I think Jerome Ford has the explosiveness to potentially get a lot of good stats, but at the end of the day, the bottom line is there's no one quite like Nick Chubb that can really replace his value. And so the Browns have to hope that they can get at least some modicum of success out of Nick Chubb before it's too late. And I think that right now it's a very thin line between him succeeding and him ultimately getting closer and closer to retirement. Now, I think that being said, situational running back by committee approach for the Browns could be very helpful to them. I like Jerome Ford as an explosive guy who you might use more often on early downs. I like Pierre Strong as kind of a workhorse back. Deontay Foreman as well, perhaps more in the red zone. He's a very good red zone back foreman. And so I really believe that the loss of Nick Chubb, while it definitely hurts the fantasy stock, gives this team a lot of opportunities. Maybe one of these guys can emerge as a flex option or even a super flex option to really kind of be the surprise on your team. It can be a surprising player who could potentially win or lose you games. But this running back room is definitely going to be looked at a lot more closely because of what's happening with Nick Chubb. Let's talk about the wide receiver group. This definitely is one of those groups that's weird and wacky and fun to discuss because you have a clear number one, then there's a bunch of guys competing for that number 2 spot who have very different traits, and it's going to be very intriguing to see how all of them gel together. And that's the wide receiver room. Let's talk about them for a little bit. You have Amari Cooper, a consistent receiver, a 1,000-yard receiver any given year. It should really be Deshaun Watson's go-to target. Then you have in this picture right here Elijah Moore, who I really like as a route runner. Very capable of making contested catches. Very capable of getting targets in the red zone. Then you have Jerry Jeudy now, who you acquired from the Broncos. And he's always been someone who I really want to see more because I think he has the traits to really be a very exciting, say, outside receiver who can really stretch the field vertically. And so the variance of the wide receivers in this Browns offense really excites me, and it should excite you as fantasy football managers. Because when you think about the wide receiver market, you don't really think about brand names on the Browns. Maybe you view Amari Cooper as someone like a Mike Evans, someone who I talked about in my mock draft, where he's just a very consistent player. But I think that the reason the Browns receiving room is not viewed as highly in fantasy is just because it's so well-rounded, it's so balanced. And while I like balance, I think that when you view an entire room compared to an individual, it brings a lot more perspective to who is better than someone else. If you're really breaking down wide receiver rooms here, I don't think you would view the Browns as one where there's a clear number one player who's going to get the bulk of the stats. I think it's very even. I think Amari Cooper, at the end of the day, is just someone who is a consistent player like Mike Evans, who's always going to be a wide receiver one, but never really get the respect. He's always going to be undervalued. It's just because of this wide receiver room. who is going to be the guy behind Mari Cooper in the setup. And that's going to be the conundrum a lot of you face. But if there's one conundrum that you have no problem with, it's perhaps the conundrum of the tight end position, because David Njoku is also getting very undervalued. Last year he caught fire. That was obviously under Joe Flacco, so make of that what you will and see if he has the same kind of stats under Deshaun Watson. But at the end of the day, David Njoku kind of gets forgotten in this wild tight end market. I haven't even mentioned him. It's always been the old guard. It's always been the young guns. And David Njoku just finds himself sitting in the middle, kind of lurking in the background. But if you pick him up, he's going to be special for you. David Njoku is always someone who is going to be one of the most reliable players in this Browns offense. He's always the escape route. He's always going to be in Stefanski's plans, getting Njoku open, and special things happen. And the overall perfect fantasy player, especially from this crowded Browns offense, is perhaps Njoku. And when I fully assess this team, especially on the offensive side of the ball, and I think about what's best for them going forward, it's really keying in on getting Njoku involved in every single facet of this offense. Because if they do, that's where they got success. That's what happened with Baker. Baker found the comfortability in passing to his tight end a lot, and so did Flacco. And so that's what this Browns offense needs to succeed. Open it up for Deshaun. Get him more involved in play action. Get your best weapons involved. Find a secondary piece who can bail you out. And I think the Browns offense is going to be very diversified. And it's also going to be very intriguing for fantasy managers everywhere. That should just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we are on to one of my favorite players in all of college football. My favorite team in all of college football. That is, of course, Mr. Quinn Ewers. A big year ahead for this kid. We'll be right back to talk about him after the break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. In this next segment, should get a lot of Texas fans, including myself, very hyped. We are going to continue with our fantasy college football player profiles with a guy who wants to make a statement in his final year at UT Austin, and that is, of course, the great Quinn Ewers. Let's talk about this young man for a bit, especially in terms of fantasy, where he could be a very sneaky pick to be your starting college football fantasy quarterback. And so, the thing I love about Quinn Ewers, right, is that consistency has always been the problem with him. But a lot of people don't necessarily talk about his mentality. It's a double-edged sword here. While he hasn't been as consistent as people have wanted him to be, his mentality has entirely changed. This is a new and improved Quinn Ewers we saw from when he arrived on the Texas campus, mullet and all, not necessarily fully committed to the project, and then to where he was last year, guiding Texas to the CFP, keeping them in games, just showing a great amount of moxie and development in himself that is going to translate to Texas starring in the SEC this year and having their expectations heightened so much. I think that Quinn Ewers is more than prepared to assume the mantle in his final season as one of the elite college football quarterbacks. And so without further ado, let's talk about his fantastic season last year and what he's going to take into his final year as the Texas Longhorns starting quarterback. Last year was his best season by far, 69% completion percentage, 3,479 yards, 22 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions. A couple injuries, so who knows how much his stats could have been inflated if he started every game, but those stats certainly are very eye-popping compared to where he was as a freshman. His best performance in terms of fantasy was in that Big 12 championship game against Oklahoma State. 33.7 points, 35 for 46, 452 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 1 interception. That was the performance where a lot of people really took notice that if this Quinn Ewers showed up every day of the week, every Saturday, and played the way he did in that championship game, he would be in the reckoning for a Heisman and in the conversation as one of the elites in college football. His worst performance, though, was against Oklahoma. As we always know, the Red River rivalry brings out a lot in you, and unfortunately for Quinn Ewers, he hasn't really had a big game in the Red River rivalry to really separate him as one of the Texas elite. 12.4 points, 31 for 37, 346 yards. So not terrible in terms of his passing numbers, but 1 TD and 2 interceptions doesn't do that to you. And so, when I look at Quinn Ewers for this year, it's certainly going to be a very exciting ride for the Texas Longhorns. They believe that they can compete with Georgia in the SEC. They believe that they can get one of those byes in the CFP. But at the end of the day, I really think what it's going to come down to is the new players in this setup. They lose Jonathan Brooks. They lose Xavier Worthy. They lose Jatavion Sanders in this offense. So they needed to replace all of those guys in a hurry. So what do? They go to the portal. They get Isaiah Bond, who has a lot of potential but hasn't really starred as a wide receiver one. Last year in Alabama, he had some big plays, but he never really, got to that level where he comfortably was a wide receiver one, but I think he's going to do very well in this Longhorn setup. They got Amari Nyblack at the tight end position, another guy who could potentially have a breakout season. And they got Matthew Golden and Silas Bolden from Houston and Oregon State, respectively. And those guys round out this receiver room that brings a lot of intrigue and hope and optimism to this Texas Longhorns offense. But that's all it really is, because we haven't seen them play together. And the comfortability and rapport that Quinn Ewers developed with guys like Worthy and Sanders might have disappeared a little bit. He's now going to have to break in new guys. And while it certainly isn't beyond him to do that, I certainly believe that his mentality is going to be key here. The consistency questions are always going to arise. If he has an off day, everyone's going to be talking about that. But his mentality is key. He completely changed his mindset last year, completely bought into the culture that Texas wanted. And as a result, he got to the CFP. Had one of the best seasons for Texas since that 05 season. And so I really believe that if he just ignores the consistency and focuses on mentality, that's where a lot of success will stem from. Because developing trust in receivers is not easy, especially when most of your receiving core from last year is gone. But I do believe his saving grace is that O-line, because unlike with the skill positions, the O-line retains most of its starters. Kelvin Banks could be a first-team All-American. I really think that this O-line is going to have its way with opposing SEC defenses and really help Quinn Ewers kind of settle down. That being said, I also think a large part of Quinn Ewers' success or failures in this coming season comes down to Steve Sarkisian. Because right now, I don't believe there's a coach in this country who places more trust in his depth than Steve Sarkisian. And what I mean by that is, I think that this season, it's a bold prediction for this season, I wouldn't be surprised if he puts Manning into some games. I wouldn't be surprised if he's more bold now that Texas is one of the deeper teams in the country. And so, for Quinn Ewers, especially for his fantasy prospects as well, it's all going to be about getting off to a fantastic start early on. And it's going to be difficult. They face Michigan in week 2, and I believe it's on the road. And Michigan has its own problems, but they're still going to be viewed as one of the elite teams in the country. If Texas wins that game, it truly cements them as someone to be reckoned with. And at the end of the day, that will truly help Quinn Ewers, no matter how they win every single week. Because last year with Texas, the gods of the close games were on their side. In the SEC, where it's very top-heavy, and you're going to get a lot of blowouts early on, it's going to be important for Texas in the big moments to really play within themselves. Because you can find consistency in the cupcake matches, but to play two big teams and still have the Red River rivalry, Michigan, Georgia, and Oklahoma, that's where you need to see vintage Quinn Ewers. Say he has a subpar game against a cupcake team on his schedule. That's all fine. If Texas wins, it's fine, because you don't place as much stock on those games as others. But if he underperforms in the Red River rivalry against Georgia, that's when all the doubt will seep in. And like I said, Sarkisian has trust in depth. He has trust in numbers. And he now understands that Texas are in a period of their history where good things can happen for them. History can get rewritten. This past couple of decades can be restored should Texas, in this revamped SEC, win a couple championships and ultimately, potentially, win it all in the college football playoff. And it all starts with this year. If Quinn Ewers rides off into the sunset a champion, he will go down in history no matter how ugly or exciting his season was. It's the Texas quarterback that brought them fully back. And that will set up, subsequently, what Arch Manning can do, because there's also a lot of pressure on his shoulders. So if Quinn Ewers sets up everything nicely, if he's consistent every game, his mentality from last year carries over completely to this year, and he's like, I have new guys, but I think that they're going to work, and I'm going to trust in them to do their thing. That Quinn Ewers is going to be successful. That Quinn Ewers will restore pride and excitement and joy into the hearts of Texas fans. But if the Quinn Ewers that we see in some Red River rivalry games, the Quinn Ewers that we see in kind of games where Texas underestimates their opponents arises again, then who knows what will happen with this Texas program. If there's any sign of regression, people will immediately key into it, and that could damage this reputation of this team. And so, while Quinn Ewers should not assume so much pressure, it's definitely going to be on. In terms of fantasy, I believe there's no one better to really have a fun ride with in terms of fantasy college football, to ride onto the sunset with, than Quinn Ewers. And so, no matter how the season plays out for him, I think I'm going to trust him in his final season as a Texas Longhorn to do big things. That will just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we do some fun segments about some prop bets for different teams. We're going to start off kind of with some bad teams, but I promise as the weeks go on, more exciting teams will be talked about. But you'll see what I mean after the break on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are in the home stretch of today's show, and these last two segments are really segments that I believe will stand the test of time because they're about prop bets, and everyone loves a good prop bet. Now, these two teams, like I said, the Cardinals and Panthers, are the most exciting teams in the league, but that doesn't mean that they have this kind of stigma around them that they can't be bet upon. I think that when you look at them, they're slowly retooling and getting better. The Cardinals might be a bit further along, but there's some hope for the Panthers. But let's start off, of course, with the Arizona Cardinals, because right now, I think they're being a little underestimated. Last year, they really made some strides under Jonathan Gannon that I did not expect out of them, and as someone who follows the NFC West passionately as a Seahawks fan, I think it's nice to know that the Cardinals believe they can stay competitive in this division, because this division is always fun when all four teams can, in some fashion, find some nice little wins and be competitive. And so, while the Arizona Cardinals are one of those teams that you expect to do poorly, that doesn't mean that you can't, find a nice bet that you're comfortable with placing on them. And so I'm going to take you through three popular ones that I think can be confident bets for your portfolio. So let's start off with, let's talk about their win total or win projection. They're projected to either hit over or under 6.5 wins. And this is the one that's a little bit kind of tricky for me, because the Arizona Cardinals are definitely set up to find wins wherever they can. They can definitely sneak up on people. Their offense has certain pieces that I really like. Like I talked about, Trey McBride is going to be a tight end I really like. I drafted him in my fantasy team confidently and said, I love this kid, and I think he's going to do very well. Michael Wilson can certainly round into something. And of course, if Kyler Murray stays healthy, who knows what he brings to the QB position, and who knows how Jonathan Gannon will implement him as well. And so, when I look at this over-under, 6.5 wins certainly feels like a lot, but can this offense, is going to be the question, can this offense really lead in their performances consistently? Can Kyler Murray step back into this offense, trust his weapons, and ultimately surprise people? And I believe he can, but the reason why I'm saying this bet is tricky is because the NFC West is tricky. And that's where I believe the Cardinals will want to focus their most attention on, gaining ground in this division, finding divisional wins. And I believe that all three of the teams outside of them, the Niners, the Rams, and the Seahawks, definitely are teams that are all going to be fighting for playoff positioning. And so the Cardinals, at this moment in time, feel kind of more like spoilers, but that also adds to their win total. Say they get one of two from either the Rams or the Seahawks. Shock them a little bit. That's good for their win total. And then there's some areas of their schedule where, might lighten up. They play the NFC North. Who knows how volatile that division's going to be as well. they can find a few wins there. They can find maybe a win in the AFC East. And so all these wins could stockpile up to really come up on people and surprise them and say at the end of the season, oh, this is a pleasant surprise. I bet money on the over for the Cardinals, and they turned out to prove me correct. That being said, 6.5 wins is a very lofty standard for this team. So I would confidently say take the under, but who knows? I really think this offense is getting a little bit underestimated here. And transitioning from this bet to the next bet is going to really hinge upon how much reliance is going to be in this setup. Kyler Murray over 3,255 yards. And I think that Kyler Murray, a lot of people forget how capable he is as a passer. We saw in many different offenses over the years for the Arizona Cardinals during the Kyler Murray era where Kyler Murray was not afraid to fling the ball down the field, very often for that matter. And in that way, it opens up a lot of things for this Cardinals offense. Last year, it shocked me more than anyone. The Cardinals were one of the highest ranked teams in explosive run rate. They definitely have a very underrated running back in James Conner as well. And so, while I like that aspect of it, and I really want James Conner to do well because he's really going to make a name for himself if he continues to consistently put up the numbers that he does, I think that the Cardinals need a downfield threat. Whether it be Trey McBride in the slot running seam routes, or in the red zone, or Michael Wilson finding some consistency. I really believe that in order for Kyler Murray to hit the over on this, there's going to have to be some elements of verticality added to this offense. They're still going to want to implement Murray's legs into this offense because he's one of the most dangerous runners in the National Football League when he's carrying the football. But at this moment in time, what I want out of the Cardinals is this kind of unafraidness to really vary their offense. When the Cardinals are unafraid, that's where they can pick and choose their moments to find some success. And so, in a season where you're a team that wants to improve, but you have to find wins, I think the best option for them is going to be opening up this offense and shocking people. And while it might not add up in wins, it could add up to Kyler Murray hitting the over. It's plus 100 right now for this over, and I think that's a safe bet. It's not necessarily too long odds, and so that could be an exciting prospect for you. But at this current moment, it's going to be all about how Gannon views Kyler Murray as a passer and how he utilizes that. Now let's go to a fun bet. Let's all talk about week 1 bets. And these are fun bets because it really shows how prepared teams are for the upcoming season. In week 1, the Arizona Cardinals play the Buffalo Bills, their first AFC East game. This should be a very, very exciting game. I don't think it's going to be a telling game because I do expect the Bills to win. But I do think that in terms of points, the odds makers have it right now in terms of over-under at 48.5. This game could exceed that. I'm taking the over on this. A lot of people might take the under because, both of these offenses now have questions at the wide receiver position. And so that calls into question how these very vertical passers are going to throw the football. But that being said, these two quarterbacks know how to operate high-flying offenses, know how to operate in terms of shootouts. Josh Allen's been doing it through his career. Kyler Murray can as well. And so, if Arizona comes out guns a-blazing, Kyler Murray's throwing the ball down the field early and often, I think that this has the opportunity to be a very fun game. and it's very high scoring. However, if they stay a little bit more conservative, if the Cardinals decide that maybe they want to work Kyler Murray back into this offense, this could feel like a day off for the Buffalo Bills, and it could get ugly pretty quickly. Because I really trust that the better way to operate this offense for the Cardinals, the best way for that matter, is for Kyler Murray to be unafraid. And so, I'm confident in the fact that the over should hit, but this is such a variable game. It's such a volatile game to think about because this game isn't necessarily season defining. Arizona will be comfortable losing it because they will be 0-1 and it's just the start of the season, but it is certainly setting the bar for them. And if they don't hit that bar, then who knows? And I think that right now, look at all three bets for the Cardinals. It's all on this offense here. Can this offense really lead? Because when I look at the Cardinals' defense, there's actually a little bit of excitement around it. I really think that this defense is going to be underrated. Yes, they lose a couple of pieces up front. They still have Budda Baker, though. And I think that Jonathan Gannon is, at the end of the day, someone who's going to be a bit more defensive-minded. But when you have an offensive weapon like Kyler Murray, you definitely want to implement him early and often into this offense. And that's the key for the Arizona Cardinals if they don't want to sit in the cellar or around the cellar at the end of the season. That should just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we talk about the worst team last year in the NFL. It can't get worse than what happened last year for them, right? The Carolina Panthers. We'll end the show with them after the break. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast for the day. And we are going to end with a segment much like the last one, looking at the worst team from last year, the Carolina Panthers. Now, why would I be presenting this to you if I believe the Carolina Panthers aren't necessarily going to improve as much? Well, when you're the worst in the league, you're kind of fun to bet on, you know? Because everyone likes betting on the underdog. Everyone kind of likes, the nature that they can be worse than last year. And so there's a lot of hope and optimism when you're the worst team in the league, and there's a lot of hope and optimism in terms of betting odds because you're more confident, say, betting the under on the worst team in the league than any other team in the league. And so let's talk about the Panthers for a little bit. Now, obviously, last season was a dumpster fire. Bryce Young did not look comfortable. His skill position players were not getting open. They thought that Adam Thielen would be a nice pickup. Definitely underwhelmed. Jonathan Mingo had a very rough rookie season. And it's just not necessarily gelling. But this season looks a little bit more hopeful. They add Leggett to this offense. They add Canales, a QB whisperer, to their coaching staff. And now things are looking up for the Carolina Panthers. Not as far up as some other teams, but, the volatility of the NFC South can, get them going a little bit. And so I'm going to say that the Panthers are definitely going to be a little bit more volatile in terms of betting odds than you think. They're not going to be this confident, they're definitely hitting the under kind of feeling to them this year. There's an aura of optimism rising in the Carolina Panthers that they can be better. They want to overcome last season, erase it from their memories, and have it be a turning point in the history of this franchise to get back to being a team that can compete at the highest level. So let's start off with their win total. Right now they're at 5.5 wins for the over-under. And I'm going to take the over. And minus 115, that's not a bet that feels like you're kind of pushing it a little bit. That's a bet that could happen. And I'm not saying the Panthers are going to magically win like 6 or 7 games here. But like I said, the NFC South is volatile, man. I don't know if the Indianapolis Colts are going to be for real if Anthony Richardson isn't what they thought there was going to be. Jacksonville certainly has... No, wait, I'm talking about the AFC South. The NFC South is the Falcons. They obviously have Kirk Cousins now. They think that their offense is going to magically, transform into this juggernaut. But at the end of the day, Kirk Cousins is coming off an Achilles injury. And this offense really hasn't necessarily had a consistent level of quarterback play or a consistent offensive producer, for that matter, outside of, Drake London. Maybe Bijan can be that guy if he gets more touches like Raheem Morris said. But at the end of the day, this Falcons offense just seems like an on-paper team right now. Then we look at the Saints and their, situation. They have Chris Olave, but is Derek Carr still a serviceable NFL quarterback? Who knows? And then the Bucs certainly shocked a lot of people last year, but this year's different. The Panthers actually gained Dave Canales from Tampa Bay. And so I think there are some wins to be had for the Panthers where they shock some people a little bit. I think that if any one of those NFC South teams has an off day, this is now a team that can take advantage of that. So I would not be shocked if at the end of the season we're looking at a 6-11 Carolina Panthers squad. Now let's talk about one that's a little bit less realistic. Bryce Young over 3,175.5 yards. Now, considering the fact that he added a weapon, it's safe to say that, Bryce Young should feel a little bit more comfortable. But I can't erase from my memory the fact of how uncomfortable he seemed in that transition from the college football, where he was one of the best in the game, to the NFL. I think a safe place to start off with is around, say, 2,700 yards, maybe 2,750. Now, the reason why I think that is because I don't think that Bryce Young needs to be the best player on this team. He needs to just simplify things, not overthink, and just operate the offense the way Dave Canales tells him to, because Dave Canales is going to have a very domineering presence in this team. I think his word needs to become gospel for Bryce Young to succeed, because right now, Bryce Young seems like someone who definitely does not have the support system that other rookie quarterbacks have. I look at C.J. Stroud from last year and his first season as a rookie, and he immediately gain the trust of everyone there. And I look at Caleb now and how he's performing. I don't say the same about Bryce Young. A lot of quietness is surrounding the Carolina Panthers about what's going on with Bryce Young and how he performs. Not a lot of support has been talked about with Bryce Young. And so, I think a realistic goal for Bryce Young wouldn't be over 3,000 yards. Minus 115 is an appealing bet because you don't lose a lot of money if you get it wrong. But it just seems that right now, where Bryce Young is relative to others is very worrying. Because you don't hear about the same positivity you hear about with a C.J. Stroud or a Caleb Williams. You don't hear what Carolina's doing training camp-wise. And so, while he certainly is adding more experience to his wide receiver room, I like the addition of Deontay Johnson as well, another guy who's added to this wide receiver room. I think that it's more of a Bryce Young thing than trying to, force him to throw passes down the field than anything. I think Dave Canales really simplifies a lot of things, and I think that Bryce Young could be very similar to a Baker Mayfield where he just gets the job done. And at that current moment in time, I think that's what these Carolina Panthers need to focus on. Now let's talk about their Week 1 game. They face the New Orleans Saints. Perhaps the one team that I'm confident they can beat in this division on any given day. But it kind of sucks that it comes at the beginning of the year. You know what I mean? Both of these teams be feeling each other out. And it could be one of those games that's not entertaining at all. It could be a snooze fest here. And I don't think either of these teams will put up much of a fight against each other. That being said, there's extreme value in betting the under here because Dennis Allen coached teams are terrible against the spread, but that says more about the Saints than it does the Panthers because I would not be confident in betting on either of these teams. This game in Week 1 is a game that I will not feel comfortable where, unlike the Bills and Cardinals, where those two quarterbacks, Bryce Young and Derek Carr, does not excite me. And this coaching matchup definitely feels very interesting, where you have two guys, Dennis Allen and Frank Reich, who aren't necessarily the most exciting of coaches. I think it's all going to come down to Dave Canales. That's the thing. If Dave Canales can get the best out of Bryce Young, then that shows that the Carolina Panthers care about his development more than I believe. But as of this moment that I'm talking to you, not hearing positive or negative things out of Carolina's camp is worrying. Because the strides that Bryce Young takes are going to be very important to hear about rather than see. Because he needs to develop a good rapport, not just with his teammates and what Dave Canales thinks about the outside world, so that a different image of him can be painted. Because I think that will negatively impact him if he performs poorly. And so, when I look at the Carolina Panthers, I look at them as a team that right now has a little bit more hope than they had last year. But just a little bit, because I can't necessarily get fully behind a team that's so secretive about what they're doing with their quarterback. In terms of prop bets, it's always fun to root for the underdog, but this underdog certainly is going to be one you're going to have to grow into the season with. And that's all I can really say. But that will just about do it for today's show. Thank you guys for tuning in. I've been Christopher Shepard. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Please like, follow, and subscribe to the show. Leave a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. We will be back better than ever tomorrow with another show. Thank you guys so much.